In the chaos of war, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. Sometimes they wear uniforms and carry medals. Sometimes they carry nothing but grease-stained hands and a toolbox that's seen better days. What happens when a man who spent his life fixing broken-down cars suddenly finds himself face-to-face with 30 tons of disabled steel, enemy fire raining down around him, and soldiers depending on him for their lives? What happens when everything you thought you knew about courage gets turned upside down by someone the world overlooked? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man whose calloused hands held more power than anyone ever imagined. A man who proved that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary things. The war was supposed to be someone else's fight. The heroes were supposed to be someone else's sons. But when fate threw Marcus into the heart of battle, he discovered that fixing machines and saving lives weren't so different after all. Some stories are about the generals who plan the battles. This story is about the man who crawled under a burning tank while bullets flew overhead, because sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person willing to get their hands dirty when everyone else has given up hope. This is the true story of the day a humble mechanic became a legend. Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his oil-stained hand, leaving another dark smudge across his weathered face. The garage was sweltering in the late afternoon heat, and the ancient fan in the corner did little more than push the heavy air around. He'd been working on Mrs. Henderson's old Buick for the better part of 3 hours, and the stubborn transmission was fighting him every step of the way. The small town of Millfield had exactly one auto repair shop, and Marcus had been running it for nearly 15 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it kept food on the table for him and his daughter Sarah. At 42, Marcus had settled into the rhythm of small-town life, fixing cars, trucks, and the occasional tractor when farmers brought their equipment to him in desperation. His hands told the story of his trade. Scarred from countless encounters with sharp metal, permanently stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove, and calloused from years of gripping wrenches and wrestling with stubborn bolts. These were working hands, hands that understood machines in a way that came from experience rather than textbooks. Marcus had learned his trade from his father, who had run the same garage before him. Old Pete Thompson had been a master mechanic, the kind of man who could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it run. He'd taught his son that every machine had its own personality, its own quirks and moods. "Treat 'em with respect," Pete used to say, "and they'll tell you exactly what's wrong." The garage itself was a testament to this philosophy. Tools hung in their designated spots, organized with military precision. Parts bins were labeled and sorted. The work bays were clean despite the nature of the work. Marcus ran his shop the way his father had taught him, with discipline, attention to detail, and an almost religious devotion to doing things right. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. The radio played softly in the background, mixing country music with local news and weather reports. Marcus was focused entirely on the transmission problem when he heard the rumble of heavy vehicles approaching. The sound was different from the usual pickup trucks and family cars that frequented his shop. This was deeper, more powerful. He rolled out from under the Buick and walked to the large bay door, wiping his hands on a rag. What he saw made him stop short. A convoy of military vehicles was pulling into his small town, Humvees, supply trucks, and, bringing up the rear, a massive tank transporter carrying an M1 Abrams main battle tank. The convoy came to a stop right in front of his garage. Marcus had seen military vehicles before, of course, but never anything like this. The tank was enormous, a gray-green beast that seemed to fill his entire field of vision. Even loaded on the transport trailer, it was an intimidating sight. A young soldier jumped down from the lead Humvee and approached the garage. He couldn't have been more than 25, with sergeant stripes on his uniform and a worried expression on his face. Behind him, Marcus could see other soldiers gathering around the tank transporter, their faces equally concerned. "Excuse me, sir," the sergeant said, his voice tight with urgency. "Are you the mechanic who runs this place?" Marcus nodded, still trying to process what he was seeing. "That's me, Marcus Thompson. What can I do for you, Sergeant?" "Sergeant Mitchell, sir. We've got a problem with our tank. The main gun's hydraulic system has failed, and we've got a hydraulic fluid leak that's getting worse by the minute. We're supposed to be at Fort Braxton for exercises that start tomorrow morning, and without that tank, our entire training operation is compromised." Marcus looked past the sergeant at the massive machine on the trailer. He'd worked on hydraulic systems before, tractors, construction equipment, even some heavy trucks. But a tank? That was entirely different territory. I appreciate the situation, Sergeant, but I'm not really qualified to work on military equipment. That's way outside my area of expertise. Sergeant Mitchell's face fell. Sir, with respect, you're the only qualified mechanic within 100 miles of here. The next town with a shop that might be able to help is 3 hours away, and we don't have that kind of time. The tank can't travel with that leak. We're losing fluid faster than we can replace it. Marcus walked closer to the tank transporter, studying the massive vehicle. Even from the ground, he could see dark fluid dripping from somewhere beneath the turret. The leak was substantial, forming a growing puddle on the trailer bed. How long has it been leaking? He asked. Started about an hour ago, Mitchell replied. At first it was just a few drops, but it's gotten progressively worse. Our unit mechanic tried to tighten some fittings, but he thinks there's a blown seal somewhere in the system. Marcus climbed up onto the trailer, getting a closer look at the tank. The M1 Abrams was an impressive piece of machinery, 68 tons of advanced engineering and raw power. The main gun alone probably weighed as much as 3 cars. He'd read about these tanks in magazines, but seeing one up close was an entirely different experience. The hydraulic fluid was definitely coming from somewhere in the turret mechanism. Marcus could see the wet streaks running down the side of the tank where the fluid had been blown back by the wind during transport. He knew enough about hydraulics to understand that the main gun's elevation and traverse systems would be completely dependent on hydraulic pressure. Without it, the tank's primary weapon would be useless. What kind of fluid does it use? Marcus asked. MIL H46170. Mitchell replied immediately. It's a specialized hydraulic fluid designed for military applications. Marcus climbed down from the trailer, his mind working through the possibilities. Hydraulic systems were hydraulic systems, regardless of their application. The principles were the same whether you were dealing with a tractor's bucket controls or a tank's gun system. Pressure, flow, seals, and pumps. The fundamentals didn't change. I might be able to help, he said finally. But I'll need to get the tank off that trailer and into my garage. And I'll need to see if I can get my hands on some of that specialized fluid. Mitchell's face brightened with hope. We can handle the fluid, sir. We've got spare supplies with us. And we can unload the tank. But are you sure your garage can handle something that heavy? Marcus looked back at his shop. It was a solid building, built in the 1950s when things were constructed to last. The concrete floor was thick and reinforced. It had been designed to handle heavy farm equipment back when the garage served the agricultural community. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate the tank, and the bay doors were wide enough, though it would be a tight fit. The building can handle it, Marcus said. The question is whether I can handle the tank. For the next hour, Marcus worked with the soldiers to carefully maneuver the massive tank into his garage. It was a delicate operation that required precise coordination. The tank transporter backed up to the bay doors, and using the trailer's hydraulic ramps and the tank's own drive system, they slowly drove the M1 Abrams into the workshop. The garage was transformed by the tank's presence. What had seemed like a spacious work area suddenly felt cramped with 68 tons of armored vehicle taking up most of the floor space. The tank's bulk dwarfed every other piece of equipment in the shop, making Marcus's hydraulic lifts and tool cabinets look like toys in comparison. Once the tank was positioned, Marcus began his preliminary examination. He started by studying the technical manuals that Sergeant Mitchell provided, trying to understand the hydraulic system's layout and operation. The diagrams were complex, showing a sophisticated network of pumps, valves, accumulators, and actuators that controlled not just the main gun but also the tank's transmission and other systems. The main gun hydraulic system was particularly intricate. It had to be capable of moving the massive gun with precision while maintaining enough power to handle the tremendous forces involved. The system operated under extremely high pressure, far higher than anything Marcus had worked with before. As he studied the manuals and examined the tank, Marcus began to appreciate the engineering that had gone into this machine. Every component was designed for reliability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. These tanks were built to function in combat, where failure wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. The soldiers waited anxiously as Marcus worked. They'd set up a temporary camp in the parking lot behind the garage, and Marcus could see them through the windows, checking their watches and discussing their situation in hushed tones. The pressure was mounting, and everyone knew it. As evening approached, Marcus had located the source of the leak. It was exactly what Sergeant Mitchell's unit mechanic had suspected, a blown seal in one of the main hydraulic actuators that controlled gun elevation. The seal had failed completely, allowing hydraulic fluid to escape at an alarming rate. The problem was access. The failed actuator was buried deep within the tank's turret mechanism, surrounded by armor plating and other components. To reach it, Marcus would need to partially disassemble the turret's internal mechanisms, a job that would normally be performed by a team of military specialists using specialized tools and equipment. Marcus stood in his garage that evening, surrounded by hydraulic fluid, technical manuals, and the most advanced piece of military hardware he'd ever seen. The task ahead of him seemed impossible. He was just a small-town mechanic who fixed cars and trucks. What business did he have working on a machine of war? But as he looked at the faces of the young soldiers depending on him, Marcus remembered his father's words. Every machine has its own personality. Treat them with respect, and they'll tell you exactly what's wrong. Maybe this tank wasn't so different from any other machine after all. It was bigger, more complex, and infinitely more powerful, but at its heart, it was still just a machine with a problem that needed solving. Marcus Thompson rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The next morning would bring challenges he'd never imagined, but for now, he focused on what he knew best, understanding the machine in front of him and figuring out how to make it work again. The tank might be a weapon of war, but tonight, it was just another broken machine in Marcus Thompson's garage, waiting for the healing touch of a master mechanic's hands. Outside, the soldiers settled in for what they hoped would be their last night in Millfield. Inside the garage, Marcus worked by the light of fluorescent bulbs, surrounded by the smell of hydraulic fluid and the quiet hum of the tank's auxiliary systems. He had no idea that his decision to help these soldiers would soon change his life forever, or that the skills he was about to demonstrate would be needed in ways he could never have imagined. The story was just beginning. Marcus spent the entire night working on the tank, his garage illuminated by the harsh glare of portable work lights that the soldiers had provided. The hydraulic system was unlike anything he'd encountered before, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Pressure in, movement out, with seals and valves controlling the flow. By dawn, he had successfully replaced the blown seal and reassembled the gun elevation mechanism. The repair had required him to remove dozens of components, each one carefully labeled and set aside in the precise order it would need to be reinstalled. His years of methodical work habits served him well. There was no room for error when dealing with something this complex. Sergeant Mitchell and his team gathered around as Marcus fired up the tank's auxiliary power unit and tested the hydraulic system. The main gun moved smoothly through its full range of motion, elevating and depressing with the quiet efficiency that only properly functioning hydraulics could provide. The leak was gone, and the system pressure readings were exactly where they should be. "Outstanding work, sir," Mitchell said, his relief evident. "I don't know how to thank you." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, feeling the satisfaction that came from a job well done. "Just doing what I can to help." The soldiers prepared to load the tank back onto its transporter, but as they were making final preparations, Mitchell's radio crackled to life. The voice coming through was urgent, stressed. "Charlie 7, this is command. Change of mission. Proceed immediately to grid reference 2847 to 5691. Emergency support required for Alpha Company. They're pinned down and taking heavy fire. ETA critical." The color drained from Mitchell's face. "Roger, command. Understood. Charlie 7 en route." Marcus didn't understand the military jargon, but he could read the sudden tension in every soldier's posture. Whatever was happening, it wasn't a training exercise anymore. "What's going on?" Marcus asked. Mitchell was already issuing orders to his team, but he paused long enough to explain. "There's been an incident at the training facility. One of our companies is in real trouble. We need to get there now." "What kind of incident?" "The kind where people die if we don't move fast enough." Marcus watched as the soldiers worked with practiced efficiency to load the tank and secure their equipment. The casual atmosphere of the previous day was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for combat. Even though this was supposedly still on American soil, still part of a training exercise, something had gone very wrong. As the convoy prepared to depart, Mitchell approached Marcus one final time. "Sir, I know this is highly irregular, but would you consider coming with us? If something goes wrong with that tank again, we're going to need someone who can fix it." Marcus looked at his garage, then at his daughter's school photo on his desk, then back at the young sergeant. "I'm not military. I don't belong in whatever situation you're heading into. Sir, with respect, you're the only person within 300 miles who's proven they can work on this equipment. If that hydraulic system fails again, and we can't fix it, good soldiers are going to die. The weight of the decision pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. He was a civilian, a small-town mechanic with a daughter to think about. But he was also the man who had just spent 12 hours learning every detail of this tank's hydraulic systems. If something went wrong, he might be the only person who could fix it. How long would I be gone? Hard to say, sir. Could be a few hours, could be longer. Depends on what we find when we get there. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, though not for the reasons he expected. He grabbed his tool bag and a selection of hydraulic fittings and seals that might be needed, threw them in the back of one of the Humvees, and climbed into the passenger seat. The convoy raced through the countryside at speeds that would have terrified Marcus under normal circumstances. The tank transporter, despite its massive load, kept pace with the lighter vehicles. Marcus could see the grim determination on the faces of the soldiers around him. These young men and women were heading into danger, and they were bringing him along. As they drove, Mitchell filled Marcus in on what little he knew about the situation. Alpha Company had been conducting a live-fire exercise when something had gone catastrophically wrong. Initial reports suggested that what was supposed to be a simulated attack had turned real, with actual enemy forces somehow infiltrating the training area. Details were scarce, but casualties were mounting. The closer they got to their destination, the more evidence Marcus saw of something serious happening. They passed other military convoys heading in the same direction. Helicopters thundered overhead, and the radio chattered constantly with urgent communications. When they finally reached the staging area, Marcus was overwhelmed by the scale of the military response. Hundreds of vehicles, thousands of soldiers, and a command structure that seemed to be coordinating a major operation. This was far beyond anything he had imagined when he agreed to come along. The staging area was a scene of controlled chaos. Medical helicopters were landing and taking off constantly, carrying wounded soldiers to nearby hospitals. Command vehicles bristled with radio antennas and were surrounded by officers studying maps and coordinating the response. The air was thick with diesel exhaust and the tension of impending action. Marcus stayed close to Mitchell and his team as they reported to the forward command post. Through fragments of conversation, he began to piece together what had happened. A foreign military unit, the exact nationality was classified, had somehow infiltrated the training area and attacked Alpha Company during their exercise. What had started as a routine training mission had turned into a real battle on American soil. The situation was serious enough that the military was treating it as a potential act of war. The attackers had brought heavy equipment, including their own armored vehicles, and they had taken defensive positions in the mountainous terrain surrounding the training area. Alpha Company was pinned down in a valley with limited cover, taking casualties, and unable to withdraw. That's where Charlie 7 came in. The M1 Abrams tank that Marcus had just repaired was exactly the kind of heavy firepower needed to break the enemy positions and allow Alpha Company to escape. But the terrain was challenging, and the approach to the battle zone would put tremendous stress on all the tank systems. As the battle plan was explained, Marcus began to understand why his presence might be crucial. The tank would need to traverse difficult mountain roads, operate at extreme angles, and potentially sustain damage from enemy fire. If any of its systems failed during the mission, there would be no time to transport it back to a proper maintenance facility. Field repairs would be the only option, and Marcus was now the person most familiar with this particular tank's hydraulic systems. The mission briefing was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Officers pointed to satellite photos and terrain maps, explaining firing positions, approach routes, and extraction plans. The language was clinical and professional, but Marcus could read between the lines. Soldiers were dying, and this mission was their only chance of survival. As the convoy prepared to move out, Marcus found himself issued a helmet and body armor. The gear felt foreign and uncomfortable, but the soldiers assured him it was necessary. Where they were going, everyone would be a target. The approach to the battle zone took nearly an hour, winding through mountain roads that barely seemed capable of supporting the weight of the tank transporter. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Marcus could hear the distant sound of gunfire, not the controlled pops of a training exercise, but the sustained, desperate rattle of a real firefight. When they reached the final staging position, Marcus got his first view of the battlefield. Through binoculars provided by one of the soldiers, he could see the valley where Alpha Company was trapped. Smoke rose from multiple locations, and Even at this distance, he could see the muzzle flashes of weapons being fired from both sides. The plan was straightforward in concept, but terrifying in execution. The M1 Abrams would be unloaded from its transporter and would proceed down a narrow mountain road to a position where it could provide fire support for Alpha Company. The tank's heavy gun would destroy the enemy positions, allowing the trapped soldiers to withdraw to safety. What made the plan particularly dangerous was the terrain. The mountain road was narrow, with steep drops on one side and rocky walls on the other. There was no room for error. One mistake would send the tank tumbling down the mountainside. Worse, the road was exposed for much of its length, meaning the tank would be vulnerable to enemy fire during the approach. Marcus watched nervously as the tank was unloaded from its transporter. The massive machine seemed even more imposing here in the mountains, its gray bulk standing out against the rocky landscape. The crew, for soldiers who lived and fought in this mechanical beast, performed their pre-combat checks with the efficiency born of training and experience. The tank commander, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was a veteran with multiple combat deployments. His crew gunner, loader, and driver were all experienced professionals who had worked together for over a year. They moved around and through the tank with the fluid coordination of a well-oiled team. "Sir," Rodriguez said to Marcus, "we appreciate what you did for us back at your garage. This bird's running smooth thanks to you." Marcus nodded, still struggling to process the surreal nature of his situation. 12 hours ago, his biggest concern had been Mrs. Henderson's Buick transmission. Now he was on a mountainside, watching soldiers prepare for combat in a tank he had helped repair. As the tank moved out, beginning its descent down the treacherous mountain road, Marcus rode in a command Humvee that would follow at a safe distance. Through the radio, he could hear the constant chatter between the tank crew, their supporting infantry, and the command post. The professional calm in their voices belied the extreme danger they were all facing. The tank made good progress initially, its tracks gripping the rough road surface as it navigated the switchbacks and steep grades. Marcus found himself holding his breath every time the massive vehicle took a particularly sharp turn, certain that it would slide off the narrow roadway. Then, halfway down the mountain, disaster struck. The radio erupted with urgent voices as the tank came under fire from a hidden enemy position. Marcus could see muzzle flashes from a rocky outcropping about 1,000 yards away, and seconds later, he heard the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds passing overhead. The tank crew responded immediately, bringing their main gun to bear on the enemy position. But, as the turret began to traverse, there was a mechanical grinding sound that carried clearly across the mountain air, followed by Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "Command, Charlie 7 Actual. We have a malfunction in the turret traverse system. Main gun is locked in position. Repeat, main gun is non-operational." Marcus felt his heart sink. The hydraulic system he had so carefully repaired was failing again, but this time it wasn't in the safety of his garage. This time, soldiers' lives depended on that gun working, and those soldiers were currently taking fire from an enemy that seemed determined to destroy them. The mountain road suddenly seemed very far away, and the sound of gunfire very close. Marcus Thompson, small-town mechanic, was about to discover what it really meant to fix a tank in the midst of battle. The Humvee carrying Marcus raced down the mountain road toward the disabled tank, enemy rounds cracking through the air around them. Through the windshield, Marcus could see the M1 Abrams sitting motionless on the narrow roadway, its main gun pointed uselessly off to one side, instead of toward the enemy positions that continued to pour fire down on them. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, calm despite the circumstances. "Command, we're taking consistent fire from grid 2849 to 5694. Unable to return fire due to turret malfunction. Request immediate support." The response from command was immediate, but grim. "Charlie 7 Actual, no additional fire support available at this time. All assets committed to extraction operation. You are ordered to hold position and provide whatever support possible." Marcus understood the implications even if the military language tried to soften them. The tank crew was on their own, trapped on an exposed mountain road with a broken weapon and an enemy that seemed content to keep shooting at them until something gave way. As their Humvee pulled up behind the tank, Marcus could see the problem immediately. Hydraulic fluid was again streaming from the turret mechanism, but this leak was far worse than the one he had repaired in his garage. The fluid was spraying out under pressure, creating a dark stain on the rocky ground that grew larger by the second. The damage was clearly battle-related. Marcus could see fresh gouges in the tank's armor where enemy rounds had struck, and one of those impacts had apparently severed a hydraulic line in the turret system. It wasn't a failed seal this time. It was combat damage that would require an entirely different kind of repair. Stay in the vehicle. The Humvee commander ordered Marcus as they took cover behind the tank's massive bulk. This is as close as civilians get to a firefight. But Marcus was studying the damage, his mechanic's mind automatically analyzing the problem. The severed hydraulic line was accessible. He could see exactly where it had been cut by shrapnel. It was a high-pressure line, which explained the dramatic fluid loss. But it was also a line he could repair if he could get to it. The problem was location. The damaged line was on the side of the tank, facing the enemy positions. To reach it, someone would have to expose themselves to direct fire from shooters who had already proven their accuracy by disabling the tank in the first place. Rodriguez appeared at the back of the tank, crouching low to avoid the intermittent rifle fire that continued to snap overhead. "Command wants to know if there's any way to get this gun operational again," he said to the Humvee commander. "We've got eyes on the enemy positions, but we can't engage without turret traverse." Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Without waiting for permission, he grabbed his tool bag and climbed out of the Humvee. "I can fix it," he called to Rodriguez over the sound of gunfire. "But I'll need to get to the other side of the tank." Rodriguez stared at him. "Sir, you can't be out here. This isn't a garage, this is a combat zone." "That hydraulic line is severed," Marcus replied, pointing toward the source of the fluid leak. "I can splice in a temporary repair, but someone has to get to it." The staff sergeant looked from Marcus to the disabled gun and back again. Marcus could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the risk to a civilian against the lives of the soldiers who were depending on this tank to save them. "Sir, I can't ask you to do that. Those shooters have a clear line of sight on that side of the tank." "You're not asking," Marcus said, checking his tool bag to make sure he had everything he would need. "I'm volunteering." What happened next would be debated in military circles for years afterward. Rodriguez made the tactical decision to allow a civilian to attempt a combat repair under enemy fire. It violated numerous regulations and put Marcus in extreme danger, but it was also the only chance of getting the tank's gun operational again. The plan was hastily developed, but executed with military precision. Rodriguez and his crew would provide covering fire while Marcus made his way to the damaged hydraulic line. They would use smoke grenades to obscure the enemy's vision and coordinate their fire to keep the shooters suppressed long enough for Marcus to complete his repair. Marcus had never been shot at before. As he prepared to leave the relative safety of the tank's rear, he found that his hands were shaking slightly. This wasn't fear, exactly. It was the body's natural response to an utterly unnatural situation. He was a small-town mechanic about to crawl under a 68-ton tank, while people with rifles tried to kill him. "On my mark," Rodriguez said, his M4 rifle ready. "Go." Smoke grenades popped around the tank, creating a gray haze that provided some concealment. Marcus heard the distinctive crack of American weapons returning fire as Rodriguez and his crew engaged the enemy positions. Then, he was moving, crawling along the side of the tank toward the damaged hydraulic line. The world became very small and very immediate. Marcus could hear his own breathing, amplified inside the helmet he wore. He could hear the mechanical sounds of the tank's running engine and cooling fans. And, underneath it all, he could hear the pop and crack of gunfire as both sides exchanged shots across the mountain valley. The severed hydraulic line was exactly where he had expected to find it. A piece of shrapnel had sliced cleanly through the steel-braided hose, creating a gap of about 3 inches. Under normal circumstances, this would be a routine repair. Cut out the damaged section, install a coupling, and connect new hose segments. But these weren't normal circumstances. Marcus was lying on rocky ground, partially under a tank, with bullets occasionally striking the armored vehicle above him. The metallic ring of projectiles hitting steel was unlike anything he had ever heard, and each impact sent vibrations through the tank's hull that he could feel in his bones. Working quickly, Marcus cut away the damaged section of hose and prepared the ends for coupling. His hands moved with the automatic precision that came from years of practice, but his mind was hyper-aware of every sound around him. The covering fire from Rodriguez's crew was keeping the enemy suppressed, but Marcus knew that wouldn't last forever. The repair required him to connect 3 separate pieces, 2 sections of hydraulic hose joined by a high-pressure coupling. Each connection had to be perfect. A single leak would cause the system to fail again, and there wouldn't be a second chance for this kind of repair. As Marcus worked, he became aware that the enemy fire was intensifying. He could hear Rodriguez shouting orders to his crew, and The American return fire was becoming more rapid and sustained. Through the smoke, he caught glimpses of muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions. The situation was deteriorating quickly. How much longer? Rodriguez called down to him. 2 minutes, Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure if that was optimistic or realistic. The coupling connections required precise torque to ensure they wouldn't blow apart under pressure, but he was working by feel with bullets flying overhead. Then, the smoke began to clear, and Marcus realized he was running out of concealment. The enemy shooters would soon have a clear view of his position, and there was nowhere to hide on the exposed mountainside road. That's when he heard a sound that changed everything. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching from the valley below. Through the thinning smoke, Marcus could see a military helicopter rising up the mountainside, its nose guns already beginning to engage the enemy positions. The helicopter's arrival created the distraction that Marcus needed. Enemy fire shifted toward the new threat, giving him the precious minutes required to complete his repair. He made the final connection on the hydraulic coupling and quickly began refilling the system with spare fluid that the tank crew had provided. "Try it now," Marcus called to Rodriguez. Inside the tank, the gunner activated the turret traverse system. There was a moment of suspense as the hydraulic pumps built pressure. Then, the massive gun barrel began to move smoothly across its arc of fire. "Gun operational," Rodriguez reported over the radio. Acquiring targets. What followed was a demonstration of the devastating effectiveness of a properly functioning M1 Abrams tank. The 120mm main gun spoke once, and an entire enemy position simply disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. The tank traversed to a new target and fired again, with the same decisive result. Within minutes, the enemy fire had ceased entirely. The combination of the tank's heavy gun and the helicopter's supporting fire had eliminated the threat that had been keeping Alpha Company pinned down in the valley below. Marcus crawled out from under the tank, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. The repair was complete, but he felt like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. Rodriguez appeared beside him, grinning broadly despite the dirt and sweat covering his face. "Sir, I don't know what they're going to put in the official report about this, but you just saved a lot of lives today." Marcus looked down at his hands, still stained with hydraulic fluid, but now also covered with the grime and dust of the mountainside. These same hands that had spent years fixing cars and trucks had just repaired a tank under enemy fire. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of him. The radio crackled with the voice of the company commander. "Charlie 7, this is Alpha 6. Outstanding work. The route is clear, and we're beginning extraction now. Thanks to you and your crew, all our people are coming home." As Marcus gathered his tools and prepared for the journey back up the mountain, he reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 2 days ago, his biggest concern had been a stubborn transmission in Mrs. Henderson's Buick. Today, he had crawled under a tank while people shot at him and fixed a hydraulic system that helped save the lives of soldiers he had never met. The helicopter that had provided fire support was now landing nearby to check on the tank crew and ensure that Marcus was unhurt. As he walked toward the aircraft, Marcus realized that this experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He was no longer just a small-town mechanic. He was the man who had fixed a tank in the midst of battle, and that distinction would follow him for the rest of his life. But the immediate crisis was over. The tank was operational, the enemy had been defeated, and Alpha Company was safe. Marcus Thompson was ready to go home to his garage and his normal life, not knowing that his extraordinary day was far from over. The helicopter ride back to the main base was supposed to be routine, a quick evacuation to get Marcus away from the combat zone and back to safety. But as they flew over the mountainous terrain, the pilot's voice came through the headset with news that made Marcus's stomach drop. "Base, this is Dustoff 7. We've got a situation developing at Firebase Delta. Enemy forces have broken through the perimeter and are advancing on the ammunition depot. All available assets are being diverted to support." Through the helicopter's window, Marcus could see smoke rising from what looked like a small military outpost nestled in a valley several miles away. Even from this distance, he could see the flashes of weapons fire and the movement of vehicles around the besieged position. The pilot continued, "Base, I'm carrying the civilian mechanic who repaired Charlie 7. What are your instructions?" The response was immediate and urgent. "Dustoff 7, proceed directly to Firebase Delta. We have multiple vehicles down and need immediate mechanical support." The civilian is cleared for emergency assistance under combat conditions. Marcus felt the helicopter bank sharply to the left as they changed course toward Firebase Delta. The pilot's voice was apologetic but firm. "Sir, I know you signed up to fix one tank, but it looks like we're going to need you again." As they approached the firebase, Marcus could see the scope of the problem. The base was under direct attack by what appeared to be a significant enemy force. Vehicles were burning, and defensive positions were being overwhelmed. But what caught his attention were the disabled military vehicles scattered around the compound. Humvees, armored personnel carriers, and support vehicles that had been damaged by enemy fire or mechanical failure. "How many vehicles are down?" Marcus asked through the intercom. "At least 6 that we can see from here," the pilot replied. "Maybe more. That's the base's entire mobile defense capability." Marcus understood the implications immediately. Without their vehicles, the soldiers at Firebase Delta would be unable to mount an effective defense or evacuate if the situation became untenable. They would be trapped, facing an enemy force that seemed to have significant advantages in both numbers and equipment. The helicopter landed in what appeared to be the Firebase's motor pool, though calling it a motor pool was generous. It was really just a fenced area filled with broken and burning vehicles. The noise was overwhelming: gunfire, explosions, shouting voices, and the constant rumble of engines from both friendly and enemy vehicles. As Marcus climbed out of the helicopter, he was met by a harried-looking captain who had to shout to be heard over the din of battle. "Are you the mechanic who fixed the tank up on Ridge 47? "Yes, sir." "Marcus Thompson." "Captain Williams." "I'll be straight with you, Mr. Thompson. We're in deep trouble here. Half our vehicles are down, and without them, we can't maintain our defensive positions. If you can get even a few of those machines running again, you might save this entire base." Marcus looked around at the chaos surrounding them. This wasn't like the mountain road where he'd had the protection of the tank's armor. Here, the fighting was close and immediate. He could see enemy muzzle flashes from positions that seemed dangerously close to the motor pool. "What kind of problems are we talking about?" Marcus asked, having to duck as a burst of automatic weapons fire passed overhead. "Everything," Williams replied grimly. "Combat damage, mechanical failures, electrical problems. Our unit mechanics are either wounded or pinned down in other parts of the base. You're all we've got." The first vehicle Marcus examined was an M1126 Stryker armored vehicle that had taken a direct hit from what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade. The blast had damaged the engine compartment and severed several critical systems, but Marcus could see that the engine itself was intact. The damage looked worse than it actually was. Working quickly, Marcus began rerouting damaged wiring and bypassing destroyed components. The Stryker's electrical system was more complex than anything in his garage, but the principles were the same. Power had to flow from the source to the components that needed it. If the primary path was damaged, you found an alternative route. As he worked, Marcus became aware of Captain Williams coordinating the base's defense from a position just a few yards away. The situation was clearly deteriorating. Enemy forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and the defenders were running low on ammunition and options. "How long until reinforcements arrive?" Marcus heard one of the sergeants ask. "At least 2 hours," Williams replied. "Maybe longer. We have to hold what we've got until then." 2 hours seemed like an eternity. Marcus could see that several of the base's defensive positions had already been abandoned, and the perimeter was shrinking by the minute. If the defenders lost any more ground, the motor pool would be within direct fire range of enemy positions. Marcus finished his work on the Stryker and signaled to its crew. "Try it now." The vehicle's engine roared to life, and its systems came online with a series of electronic chirps and beeps. The crew cheered, and within minutes, the Stryker was rolling toward the perimeter to reinforce the defensive line. But there was no time to celebrate. Marcus was already moving to the next disabled vehicle, a Humvee that had been immobilized by what appeared to be a mechanical failure rather than combat damage. The engine would turn over, but wouldn't start, and the crew reported that it had been running roughly for days before finally quitting. This was familiar territory for Marcus. Engine problems were his specialty, and he quickly diagnosed a clogged fuel system combined with a failing ignition module. Under normal circumstances, this would be a routine repair that might take an hour or two. But with bullets flying overhead and explosions rattling the ground, Marcus had to work faster than he'd ever worked before. As he labored to repair the Humvee, Marcus became aware of a change in the sounds of battle around him. The enemy fire was getting closer, and he could hear Captain Williams issuing orders to pull back to secondary defensive positions. The base was losing ground quickly. How much longer? Williams shouted over to Marcus. 5 minutes, Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure if he actually had that much time. Enemy rounds were beginning to impact closer to the motor pool, and he could see tracers passing through the air above his position. The Humvee's engine suddenly caught and settled into a steady idle. Marcus had bypassed the fuel system blockage and installed a spare ignition module that he'd found in the vehicle's maintenance kit. The truck was operational again, though the repair was definitely temporary. As the Humvee crew prepared to rejoin the fighting, Marcus moved to examine the next disabled vehicle. But before he could begin work, Captain Williams grabbed his arm. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk. The situation has changed." Williams led Marcus to a concrete bunker that served as the base's command post. Inside, radio operators were maintaining constant contact with higher headquarters while officers studied maps and coordinated the increasingly desperate defense. "Here's the situation," Williams explained. "We've lost contact with 2 of our observation posts, and enemy forces have taken the high ground on the eastern ridge. They're bringing up heavy weapons, mortars, maybe even artillery. When those guns get into position, they'll be able to hit every part of this base." Marcus studied the map Williams was indicating. Even with his limited military knowledge, he could see that the base was in an extremely vulnerable position. Surrounded by higher terrain on 3 sides, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel once the enemy got their heavy weapons positioned. "What does that mean for the evacuation?" Marcus asked. "That's the problem. We can't evacuate. Our transport helicopters can't land under direct fire, and our ground vehicles are either destroyed or needed for the defense. We're stuck here until reinforcements arrive." Williams paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Thompson, we need to ask something of you that goes way beyond what anyone should have to do. We've got 3 more vehicles that might be reparable, 2 Humvees, and another Striker. If you can get them running, we might be able to mount a counterattack to retake the eastern ridge before those heavy weapons get into position." Marcus looked around the command bunker at the faces of the soldiers depending on him. These weren't the abstract concepts of patriotism and military service that he'd read about in newspapers. These were real people, young men and women not much older than his daughter, who were trapped in an impossible situation and looking to him for help. "What happens if I can't fix them?" Marcus asked. "Then, we try to hold out with what we have and hope reinforcements arrive before we're overrun." The weight of responsibility was crushing. Marcus was being asked to determine the fate of an entire military base with nothing but his mechanical skills and a tool bag. Every decision he made, every repair he attempted, could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. "I'll do what I can," Marcus said simply. The next hour was the most intense of Marcus Thompson's life. Working under constant enemy fire, he repaired fuel systems, electrical components, and mechanical linkages on vehicles that had been written off as total losses. Each repair was a race against time, with the sounds of battle growing closer and more desperate as the base's perimeter continued to shrink. The most challenging repair was the damaged Striker, which had taken multiple hits from small arms fire. The damage had disrupted its computer-controlled systems, turning the sophisticated vehicle into 8 tons of expensive junk. But Marcus found that many of the systems could be operated manually if you knew how to bypass the electronic controls. As he worked, Marcus could hear Captain Williams coordinating the planned counterattack. The plan was risky. Use the newly repaired vehicles to punch through the enemy lines and retake the high ground before the heavy weapons could be brought into action. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option that might save the base. When Marcus finally emerged from under the last Striker, covered in grease and exhaustion, he found that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Enemy forces had taken several more defensive positions, and the base was now under direct small arms fire from multiple directions. "All vehicles operational?" Williams asked. Marcus nodded, too tired to speak. In the past hour, he had performed mechanical miracles that should have taken days to complete. 6 military vehicles that had been written off as destroyed were now running and ready for combat. "Outstanding. Mount up, you're coming with us." Marcus stared at the captain. "Sir, I'm not a soldier. I can't. Mr. Thompson, those vehicles are held together with mechanical band-aids and prayer. If something breaks during the assault, there won't be time to bring them back here for repair. We need you with us." As Marcus climbed into the lead Humvee, he reflected on how far he'd come from fixing Mrs. Henderson's Buick. In the span of 18 hours, he'd gone from being a small-town mechanic to a civilian contractor performing combat repairs under enemy fire. Now he was about to participate in a military assault designed to save an entire base from being overrun. The convoy of repaired vehicles rolled toward the perimeter, their engines running smoothly despite the hasty nature of Marcus's repairs. Through the windshield, he could see the enemy positions on the eastern ridge, the high ground that had to be retaken if Firebase Delta was going to survive. Marcus Thompson, small-town mechanic, was about to discover that sometimes the line between fixing machines and saving lives was thinner than anyone realized. The assault on the eastern ridge began at dawn, with Marcus riding in the lead Humvee alongside Captain Williams and his assault team. The plan was aggressive and risky. Use the newly repaired vehicles to punch through enemy defensive positions and retake the high ground before enemy heavy weapons could be brought into position. Marcus watched through the vehicle's bulletproof windows as the convoy approached the enemy lines. The fighting was unlike anything he had imagined. Not the clean, distant warfare portrayed in movies, but a close, brutal exchange of fire between determined opponents who were separated by only a few hundred yards of rocky terrain. The first phase of the assault went better than expected. The enemy forces had clearly not anticipated a mechanized counterattack from what they believed was a defeated garrison. The Stryker vehicles that Marcus had repaired provided heavy fire support, while the Humvees maneuvered around enemy positions, their crews dismounting to engage with small arms. But, as they climbed higher up the ridge, the mechanical stress on the hastily repaired vehicles began to show. The lead Stryker developed an electrical problem that caused its weapon systems to malfunction intermittently. One of the Humvees started overheating due to a damaged cooling system that Marcus hadn't been able to fully repair under combat conditions. Thompson, Williams called over the radio, "We're getting reports of mechanical problems in the second vehicle. Can you do anything about it from here?" Marcus studied the situation. The overheating Humvee was about 50 yards ahead of their position, taking cover behind a rocky outcropping while its crew engaged enemy positions higher up the ridge. The vehicle was still mobile, but Marcus could see steam rising from its engine compartment. "I need to get to that vehicle," Marcus replied. "The cooling system is compromised, and if the engine seizes, that crew will be stranded." What happened next would become part of military legend, though the official reports would downplay Marcus's role for security reasons. Under covering fire from the other vehicles in the convoy, Marcus left the relative safety of the command Humvee and made his way across 50 yards of contested ground to reach the disabled vehicle. The crew of the overheating Humvee was surprised to see a civilian mechanic appearing beside their vehicle in the middle of a firefight. But they quickly understood what Marcus was trying to do and provided security while he worked on their engine. The repair was improvised and desperate. Marcus used spare water from the crew's canteens to temporarily refill the cooling system, then rerouted the coolant flow to bypass a damaged radiator section. It was a field expedient that would never pass inspection, but it would keep the engine running long enough to complete the mission. As Marcus worked, the battle continued to rage around him. He could hear the distinctive crack of American M4 rifles mixing with the different sound signatures of enemy weapons. Occasionally, rounds would impact the rocky ground near the Humvee, sending chips of stone flying through the air. "Try it now," Marcus called to the driver. The Humvee's engine temperature began dropping immediately as the jury-rigged cooling system started functioning again. The vehicle was operational, though Marcus knew the repair wouldn't last more than a few hours under normal conditions, and considerably less under the stress of combat operations. As Marcus prepared to return to the command vehicle, the radio erupted with urgent calls from the lead Stryker. The electrical problems had worsened, and the vehicle's main weapon was completely non-functional. Without the Stryker's heavy firepower, the assault was stalled just short of its objective. "Can you fix it?" Williams asked over the radio. Marcus looked up the ridge toward the disabled Stryker. It was at least 100 yards away, across ground that was under direct observation by enemy positions. The vehicle was taking intermittent fire, and anyone approaching it would be completely exposed. "I can fix it," Marcus replied, "but I'll need to get inside the vehicle." What followed was the longest 100-yard sprint of Marcus Thompson's life. Using smoke grenades for concealment and supported by covering fire from every American weapon on the ridge, he made his way to the disabled Stryker while enemy rounds cracked through the air around him. Inside the Stryker, Marcus found an electrical system that had been damaged by the cumulative stress of combat operations and his earlier field repairs. The vehicle's sophisticated computer systems were failing in cascade, with one malfunction triggering others in a chain reaction that was rapidly shutting down all of the vehicle's capabilities. Working by flashlight in the cramped confines of the vehicle's electronic compartment, Marcus began systematically isolating the failed systems and rerouting power around damaged components. The Striker's crew provided constant updates on the tactical situation outside, which was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces are massing for a counterattack, the vehicle commander reported. We need that gun operational in the next 5 minutes, or we're going to be overrun. Marcus worked faster than he had ever worked before. This wasn't about perfect repairs or proper procedures. This was about getting enough functionality back online to complete the mission. He bypassed entire sections of the vehicle's electrical system, creating direct power connections that would horrify any proper technician, but that would give the crew their weapon back. Try it now, Marcus called. The Striker's main gun rotated smoothly and elevated to its firing position. The vehicle's gunner immediately engaged enemy positions that were preparing to launch their counterattack. The devastating fire from the 105mm gun broke up the enemy assault before it could begin and cleared the way for American forces to advance to their objective. Within an hour, the Eastern Ridge was back in American hands. The enemy heavy weapons that had threatened to destroy Firebase Delta were captured before they could be brought into action. The base was secure, the immediate threat was eliminated, and reinforcements were finally arriving to stabilize the entire area. As Marcus rode back down the ridge in one of the vehicles he had repaired, he felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from being a small-town mechanic to a civilian who had performed combat repairs under enemy fire and participated in a military assault that saved an entire base. Captain Williams found Marcus in the base's medical facility, where he was being checked for injuries and exhaustion. The captain's uniform was torn and dirty, but he was grinning broadly. "Mr. Thompson, I've been in the Army for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. You saved this base and everyone in it." Marcus looked down at his hands, which were finally clean after multiple washings. The cuts and scrapes were minor, but the experience had left invisible scars that he was only beginning to understand. "I just did what needed to be done," Marcus replied. "Those vehicles needed fixing, so I fixed them. It was a lot more than that, sir. You performed mechanical miracles under conditions that would challenge experienced combat engineers. And you did it as a civilian, with no military training and no obligation to be here." Over the next several days, as the situation stabilized and Marcus prepared to return home, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. He had repaired vehicles that military mechanics had written off as total losses. He had performed field modifications under enemy fire that kept critical equipment operational. He had participated in a combat assault and helped retake strategic terrain. The military wanted to recognize Marcus's contributions, but the classified nature of the operation limited their options. There would be no public ceremonies or media coverage. The official records would be classified for years, and most of the story would never be told outside of military circles. But word spread quickly through the military community about the civilian mechanic who had fixed tanks under fire and saved Firebase Delta. Marcus Thompson became something of a legend among soldiers and mechanics, though he remained largely unknown to the general public. When Marcus finally returned to his garage in Millfield, he found it exactly as he had left it. Mrs. Henderson's Buick was still sitting in the bay where he had been working on its transmission. His tools were in their proper places, and his daughter's photo was still on his desk. Everything was normal, except that Marcus himself had changed in fundamental ways. He completed the work on Mrs. Henderson's transmission, but found himself thinking about hydraulic systems in tanks rather than cars. When farmers brought their equipment for repair, he found himself examining each machine with new eyes, understanding their mechanical systems in ways that his combat experience had taught him. The story of what Marcus had done began to spread through unofficial channels. Veterans visiting the garage would sometimes hint that they knew about his military service, though Marcus had never been in the military. Other mechanics started referring cases to him that they considered impossible, having heard that Marcus Thompson was the man who could fix anything under any conditions. Marcus never spoke publicly about his experience. When people asked about his brief absence from the garage, he would simply say that he had helped some soldiers with a mechanical problem. The full story remained classified, and Marcus respected that classification even though it meant that his extraordinary service would never be fully recognized. But late at night, When the garage was quiet and Marcus was alone with his thoughts, he would remember the sound of that tank's main gun firing, the relief in Captain Williams's voice when the last vehicle was repaired, and the faces of the soldiers who had depended on him in their darkest hour. Marcus Thompson had discovered that the line between fixing machines and saving lives was often thinner than anyone realized. He had learned that courage wasn't always about wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. Sometimes it was about crawling under a tank with a wrench while bullets flew overhead, because that's what the situation required. He was still a small-town mechanic, still the man who fixed cars and trucks for the people of Millfield. But he was also the man who had fixed a tank in the midst of battle, and that distinction would stay with him for the rest of his life. Years later, when military historians finally gained access to the classified records of the Firebase Delta operation, they would struggle to explain how a civilian mechanic had performed mechanical miracles that saved an entire base. They would analyze his repairs, study his techniques, and try to understand how someone with no military training had functioned so effectively under combat conditions. But those who had been there understood the simple truth. Marcus Thompson was a master mechanic who treated every broken machine with respect and dedication, whether it was a farmer's tractor or a tank in combat. He had simply applied his skills where they were needed most, without regard for his own safety or the extraordinary nature of the circumstances. In the end, that's what heroes do. They do what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, regardless of the cost to themselves. Marcus Thompson had proven that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and sometimes the most important battles are won not by those who carry weapons, but by those who carry tools and the knowledge of how to use them. The story of the mechanic who fixed a tank in the midst of battle would be told in military circles for generations, a reminder that courage and skill can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the fate of many depends on the dedication of one person willing to do whatever it takes to keep the machines running.